The sound that stopped me on that porch wasn't a scream. It was worse than a scream. It was the sound of someone trying not to make one. I stood there with my hand still on the iron gate, keys jingling against my palm, and for a second I told myself it was the wind moving through the magnolia trees. But wind doesn't catch on a breath like that. Wind doesn't break in the middle like a person does when they're crying and trying to swallow it whole at the same time. My name is Selene Lattimore, and I built my whole life on showing up for my daughter, even when she told me not to. I want to say something before I go further. If you're watching this right now, tell me what time it is, where you are, because where I'm from, this kind of evening, soft light, porch still warm from the day, is exactly when trouble likes to show its face. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. I hadn't planned to come by unannounced. Jania had been busy for 3 weeks straight, every excuse smoother than the last. But a mother knows the difference between busy and avoiding. I drove the 40 minutes from my place to the mansion I gifted her for her 30th birthday. The one I'd signed over with more pride than I can put into words. And I let myself through that gate because something in my chest told me to. The front door was unlocked. That alone should have told me something. Jania never left that door unlocked, not since Sherwin's family moved their things in like they were staying for good instead of just a little while. I found her in the kitchen, sitting on the floor with her back against the cabinets, one hand wrapped around her other arm like she was holding herself together. There were marks on her skin. Not faded, not old. Fresh enough that the bruising hadn't finished turning color yet. "Jania." My voice came out flatter than I expected, steadier than I felt. She looked up at me and her whole face just collapsed. "Mama, you shouldn't have come." Before I could even kneel beside her, I heard footsteps coming from the hallway. Slow, unhurried, like a man who wasn't worried about being caught doing anything wrong. Sherwin. He leaned against the door frame with his arms crossed, looking at me the way you'd look at something that wandered onto your property uninvited. Not at his wife crying on the floor. At me. "She's fine," he said. "Just clumsy sometimes." I didn't answer him. I was looking at my daughter's arm. Sherwin followed my gaze. Then he shrugged, a small, careless motion, the kind that made my stomach turn. "You should have called first before coming over," he said. "Things have been calmer around here lately." The room went still. Jania lowered her eyes. Sherwin noticed and smiled. Not a happy smile, a warning smile. Then he looked back at me. "She knows what happens when she stops listening," he said lightly. "Don't you, Jania?" My daughter didn't answer. That silence told me more than words ever could. I felt my pulse start beating in my ears. I thought about 30 years of birthdays, of braiding her hair before school, of signing papers at a closing table with a pen that shook from joy instead of fear. I stood up slowly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for my phone. I looked him dead in the eye, the same way I used to look at grown men who thought I was someone they could talk over. "I hope you have a good lawyer," I said, "because you've just crossed a line you can't uncross." He laughed, short, ugly, confident. He had no idea what that sentence was about to cost him. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my car outside that mansion for almost 20 minutes after I left, replaying the year leading up to that kitchen floor, looking for the moment I should have stopped it. There wasn't one moment. That's the part that gutted me. There were 100 small ones, and I'd let every single one slide by. It started with a phone plan. Sherwin had said it made sense to combine accounts, save money, keep the family connected. Jania mentioned it to me over lunch like it was nothing, a logistics decision, not a leash. I remember nodding along, eating my salad, not once asking who could see whose messages on that account. Then it was his mother, Vernice, moving in for a few months, while she sorted out some housing trouble back home. Then his brother Trayvon came not long after, because Vernice needed help getting settled. Within 4 months, 2 extra cars sat in Janiah's driveway permanently, and every time I called to ask when they'd find their own place, Janiah laughed it off. "It's fine, Mama. It's just temporary." Temporary turned into a houseful. I started noticing the visits stopped first. Sunday dinners she used to drive 40 minutes for, gone. Replaced with text messages, short ones, about how tired she was, how busy the house had gotten, how Royale had a cold or a recital or something that always seemed to land right when I planned to come by. I should have pushed harder. I told myself I was respecting her independence. Looking back, I was watching a door close an inch at a time and calling it privacy. Her friends disappeared too, though I only noticed that in pieces. Camille stopped coming up in conversation. The book club she used to talk my ear off about, gone, unmentioned, like it had never existed. When I asked once if she still saw her old co-workers, she changed the subject so fast I assumed it was a sore spot, not a sealed door. There were other things too. Small things. The kind that don't sound like warning signs until you put them beside each other. Janiah stopped using her own debit card whenever we went out together. Sherwin handled most of the finances, she said. Easier that way. She stopped making plans more than a day or two ahead because she always needed to check with Sherwin first. And every time I offered to take Royale for a weekend so she could rest, she found a reason it wouldn't work. At the time, I saw compromise. Now I see permission being slowly replaced by approval. And Royale. My grandbaby, growing up in that house the whole time, learning things no 4-year-old should have to learn. I think back now to a Sunday call. One of the rare ones where I got Janiah alone for 2 minutes because Sherwin was outside with his brother. And I heard Royale in the background. Quiet, careful, the way children get when they've learned to read the temperature of a room before they speak. I didn't think anything of it then. I think about it now, and I can't stop. Looking back across the last year, I started counting. Not roughly, exactly. I sat in my kitchen with a notepad like I was building a case, because some part of me already knew I needed one. 8 months. 8 months since I had spoken to my daughter alone, without Vernice in the next room, without Trayvon just stopping by, without Sherwin's voice somewhere underneath hers, shaping what she said and didn't say. And then I remembered something else, something that hit me harder than I expected. 2 weeks ago, Royale had jumped at the sound of a dropped pan in my own kitchen. Not just startled. He immediately looked toward the doorway, like he was checking who was coming. I'd laughed it off in the moment. Kids startle easy, I told myself. Sitting there now, notepad in my lap, I understood exactly what that reaction had been teaching him. And I understood I had let it happen one quiet concession at a time. I didn't call the police that morning. I called a lawyer. That surprised even me. Every instinct in my body wanted to drive back to that mansion and snatch my daughter out of it with my bare hands. But 30 years of raising her had taught me something about Sherwin's kind of cruelty. The kind that smiles while it threatens you. Men like that don't fold from anger. They fold from paperwork they didn't see coming. So I called Thaddeus Renfro. I'd known Thaddeus for almost 15 years, ever since he handled a property dispute for my late sister. He had a way of talking that never raised in volume, no matter how serious the matter got. And that morning, I needed exactly that. Someone whose calm wouldn't crack under what I was about to tell him. I sat in his office with my hands wrapped around a coffee I didn't drink. and I told him everything. The bruises, the threat, the year of small concessions I'd only just added up the night before. He listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do, writing nothing down until I was finished. "Let's start with what you already know," he said. "The house, it was gifted to Janiyah alone?" "Solely her name," I said. "I made sure of that myself." He nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he'd suspected. "Then legally, Sherwin's mother, his brother, even his father if he's been living there. None of them have an ownership interest in that property. Not 1 square foot of it." For the first time since that kitchen floor, something in my chest loosened. "So we can get them out." Thaddeus set his pen down. "It's not that simple, Solane." The tightness immediately returned. Having no ownership interest doesn't automatically mean somebody can be removed overnight. Courts work through process. If we approach this strictly as a property matter, occupancy disputes, possession issues, questions about who has a right to remain there, that can take time. "How much time?" He didn't answer immediately. "Potentially months." The word hit me harder than I expected. "Months," I repeated. "While she's still in that house with him." "That's exactly the problem." He folded his hands. "If this turns into a civil property dispute, there are filings, responses, hearings, delays. People can contest things. They can raise arguments. They can force the court to work through every step." The loosening in my chest tightened right back up. "Then what do we do?" "That's the right question." I looked at him. Something in his voice told me he'd already been thinking about the answer while I was still telling the story. "This isn't primarily a property problem," he said. "It's a safety problem." The room went quiet. Thaddeus leaned forward slightly. "A protective order can move much faster than a civil property case. When a court believes someone's safety is at risk, judges have authority to act quickly. In some circumstances, they can award temporary exclusive possession of a residence while the matter is being addressed." I felt hope and fear collide in my chest at the same time. "Then I'll file it." He shook his head. "No." I blinked. "No? It's not you the court needs to hear from." The floor seemed to shift underneath me. "It's Janiyah." I stared at him. "She has to be the one to tell the court what happened," he said. "She has to be the one to file. Not you. Her." I didn't know it that same week, but I found out later, piece by piece, what happened inside that house after I drove off. And once I heard it, it explained a lot about what came next. Janiyah told me, much later, that Sherwin noticed something in her the very next morning. She said she didn't even realize she was doing it, answering him in shorter sentences, not laughing at things that used to make her laugh, holding her shoulders differently. It was like her body had already decided something her mind hadn't caught up to yet. He noticed before she did. "You've been acting strange," he told her over breakfast, watching her over the rim of his coffee cup the way you'd watch someone you suspected of stealing. She told him she was tired. He didn't believe her. Men like Sherwin never believe tired. That same day, he took her phone to update something and didn't give it back until that evening. When she finally got it back, nothing obvious looked different. That was what bothered her. But over the next few days, she noticed small things. Sherwin suddenly seemed to know who had called her. He knew when she'd spoken to people. He knew details of conversations she didn't remember telling him about. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe there wasn't. She never found proof of anything. What she did know was that after that day, privacy inside that house felt even smaller than it already had. She didn't say anything. She told me later she was too afraid to. By the end of that week, Trayvon had started finding reasons to be in whatever room Janiyah was in. If she went to the kitchen, He'd wander in for water and stay leaning against the counter, scrolling his phone. If she sat outside on the back patio with Royale, he'd suddenly need fresh air too. If she stayed in the living room, he'd eventually find a reason to sit there as well. She said it never felt like help. It felt like surveillance dressed up as family closeness. She told me she understood exactly what was happening, even if nobody ever said it out loud. Sherwin didn't trust the quiet that had settled into her since my visit, and he wasn't going to leave her alone with it. What I didn't know until much later, what chilled me when I finally heard it, was the phone call Sherwin made to his father that same week. Jenia said she'd walked past the study with Royale on her hip and heard Sherwin's voice through the half-open door, low and clipped in a way she'd learned to recognize as trouble. "She's different since her mother came by," he said. Quieter. A pause. Then, "She's watching everything now." Augustine's voice came back through the phone, muffled enough that she couldn't make out every word. But she heard enough to know the conversation wasn't about concern. It was about control. Sherwin's response was the part that stayed with her, the part she repeated to me months later exactly the way she'd heard it. "We need to move first," he said, "before they do." She didn't know what that meant yet. Neither did I. Not for a while, but looking back now, knowing everything I know, I understand exactly what he was protecting, and exactly how far he and his family were already prepared to go to keep protecting it. I found out what Sherwin had been saying about me before I ever heard it from his mouth. I heard it secondhand, from people who looked at me different the next time I ran into them, like I'd done something they were too polite to mention. The first one was Patricia, a neighbor who used to wave at me from her porch every time I visited Jania. That week, she barely met my eyes in the grocery store. When I said hello, she gave me a tight smile and found a reason to check something in her cart. I thought maybe I was imagining it. I wasn't. Jania told me later what Sherwin had been saying once she'd pieced enough of it together herself. He told his family, and apparently a few of their mutual friends, that I had shown up uninvited that day, that I'd raised my voice at him in his own home, that I'd made threats against him in front of his wife and child. He said I'd never approved of the marriage, that I was jealous of how well he provided for Jania, that I was the one trying to tear the family apart out of bitterness and control. Every word of it was a mirror flipped backward. Everything he'd done, he handed to me like a costume and dared anyone to notice it didn't fit. Vernice repeated it to anyone who'd listen. Augustin nodded along whenever it came up, adding his own flourishes. How concerned he was for his son. How some mothers can't let their daughters grow up. Trayvon didn't say much, but he didn't correct any of it either. I sat with that for 2 days before Jania called me. Her voice on the phone was different than it had been on that kitchen floor. Not broken in the same way, but thinner, like something underneath her was being slowly starved. "Mama," she said, and I could hear her trying to keep it together. "Everyone believes him, even people who know us, even people who've known you for years." "What is he telling them?" I asked, even though I already knew. "That you came in screaming, that you threatened him, that you've never liked him, and you're trying to break up our marriage because you can't stand not being in control of my life." Her voice cracked on the last part. "Camille texted me last week. She said she heard from someone that I should be careful around you. Around my own mother, Mama." I closed my eyes and let that sit for a second before I answered, because I needed my voice steady when I did. "Jania, listen to me. I know what happened in that kitchen. You know what happened in that kitchen. The truth doesn't need everybody to believe it right now. It just needs to still be true when it matters." She didn't answer right away. I could hear her breathing, uneven, like she was standing somewhere she didn't want Sherwin to hear her. "What if it doesn't matter in time?" she whispered. What if everyone already decided who's lying before we even get the chance to show them? I didn't have an answer good enough to give her in that moment. And the silence that followed told me she felt that exactly as much as I did. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was still in my robe, coffee halfway to my mouth. "Mrs. Lattimore," a voice said, "this is Officer Daniels with the County Sheriff's Department. I'm following up on a report involving an incident at—" He read off Jania's address like it belonged to a stranger. I set my cup down slowly. "A report?" "Yes, ma'am. We'd like to get your statement regarding what was reported." For a second, I just sat there holding the phone, trying to make sense of words that didn't belong together. Statement, report, incident. Like I was somehow connected to a disturbance instead of being a mother who'd found her daughter crying on a kitchen floor. "What exactly was reported?" I asked. There was a brief pause. "A complaint was filed alleging a verbal confrontation at that residence," Daniels said carefully. "I'm contacting everyone identified in the report so we can document their account." I closed my eyes. I already knew whose version of events had landed on his desk. "I can take your statement over the phone," he continued. "Or if you'd prefer, you're welcome to come by the station." "I'll come in." The answer surprised even me. But if somebody was rewriting the truth, I wanted my version written down too. The drive to the station felt longer than it was. I kept replaying that afternoon. The bruises, the threat, the calm way I'd looked Sherwin in the eye and told him he needed a lawyer. I hadn't yelled, hadn't threatened him, hadn't touched him. And yet somehow I already knew exactly where this was going. Officer Daniels was younger than I expected. Polite, professional. The kind of careful neutrality people learn when they spend their days listening to two completely different versions of the same story. He sat across from me with a manila folder resting on the desk. "We received a report from Sherwin Holt," he said. "According to his statement, you arrived at the residence uninvited, became verbally aggressive, and threatened him in front of his wife and child." I let the words settle between us. Verbally aggressive, threatened him, feared for his safety. The same man who had stood in that doorway and spoken about my daughter like she belonged to him. The same man who'd looked directly at me after she was bruised. Now he was the frightened one. "That's not what happened," I said. Daniels nodded slightly. "That's why I'm speaking with you. Not accusing, not agreeing, just listening. We document every complaint that comes in," he said. "My job isn't to decide what happened today. My job is to make sure everyone's account is properly recorded." I studied him for a moment. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest since the call began. Even if the person making the report is the one who left bruises on my daughter's arm? Something shifted in his expression. Not belief, not disbelief. Recognition. The realization that there might be more to the story than the paperwork in front of him. He opened the folder, looked down at it, then back at me. "Mrs. Lattimore," he said carefully. "If there's additional information relevant to this situation, I want to hear it." He slid a statement form across the desk. The page was blank. For a long moment, I stared at it. Then I reached for the pen. My statement at that station was 4 paragraphs long, and every word of it was true. I didn't know yet if 4 paragraphs of truth could outweigh a man's panic and a family's loyalty. But I gave them what I had, signed my name, and drove straight to Thaddeus's office afterward without calling first. "They're trying to flip it," I told him, still standing, still in my coat. "Make it look like I'm the threat." Thaddeus listened the way he always did, calm in a way that made the room feel less like it was on fire. When I finished, he leaned back and said the thing I hadn't let myself fully believe yet. "Then we stop playing defense," he said. It's time Jania files. I drove to the mansion that same evening, careful, parking down the street the way Thaddeus told me to, in case Sherwin or Trayvon were watching for my car. Jania met me at the side gate, Royale on her hip, eyes red, but steady in a way I hadn't seen since before all of this started. "I'm scared, Mama," she said. "I know," I told her. "Scared and still moving forward isn't weakness. That's the only kind of brave that means anything." We sat in my car in a church parking lot, 2 streets over, while I explained what Thaddeus had laid out for me. That she, not me, had to be the one to petition the court. That her name on that filing was what would carry weight, because she was the one who'd lived it, who'd worn the bruises, who'd stood in that kitchen while a man she married told her mother he'd hit her again. "What about what you saw?" she asked. "My account becomes part of it," I said. "A sworn statement alongside yours. What I witnessed with my own eyes. Backing up what you already know is true." She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the windshield at nothing in particular. Then she said, so soft, I almost missed it. "I haven't said anything out loud about what he did to me in over a year. Not really. Not where it counted." "It counts now," I said. "Today, it counts." The next afternoon, sitting in Thaddeus's office, Jania told her story for the official record. The bruises, the threat, the year of small rooms closing in around her. And I gave my own corroborating account right alongside it. The two of our voices finally lining up instead of being managed apart from each other. Thaddeus filed the petition for a family violence protection order that same day. 2 days later, the court clerk called. An emergency hearing had been scheduled for the following week, faster than even Thaddeus expected, given the documented injuries and the sworn eyewitness account attached. I wasn't there when the papers were served, but Jania called me right after, her voice shaking with something I hadn't heard from her in a long time. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to disbelief. "They served him in the driveway, Mama," she said. "In front of his mother, in front of Trayvon, in front of all of them." "What did he do?" She paused. "He went still," she said, like he finally understood something he hadn't let himself believe was coming. The courtroom was smaller than I expected and colder, though I think that had less to do with the air conditioning than with who was sitting on the other side of it. Sherwin came in with Augustin beside him, dressed like a man who believed appearances could still save him. Vernice sat just behind them, lips pressed into a thin line, and Trayvon slouched at the end of the row like he'd rather be anywhere else. None of them looked at Jania when she walked in. None of them looked at me either. Thaddeus sat beside Jania at the petitioner's table, calm as ever, a folder of evidence squared neatly in front of him. I sat 2 rows back, hands folded so tightly in my lap my knuckles ached. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and no patience for theatrics, moved through the hearing methodically. Thaddeus presented Jania's sworn account first. The bruising, the isolation, the threat. Then came my own statement describing what I had witnessed in that kitchen. The photographs of Jania's injuries had already been submitted with the emergency petition that allowed the hearing to be scheduled so quickly, and the judge had clearly reviewed them beforehand. Sherwin's attorney tried to frame everything as a family conflict that had spiraled out of control. A mother-in-law who never approved of the marriage. Misunderstandings. Exaggerations. The judge listened. Then she looked directly at Sherwin. "Mr. Holt, do you dispute that the petitioner has testified under oath that you threatened physical violence if she failed to comply with your demands regarding her own residence?" Sherwin's jaw tightened. His attorney leaned over to whisper something. The judge held up a hand. "I have sworn testimony, corroborating witness statements, and photographic evidence that the court finds credible enough to warrant serious concern for the petitioner's safety." The room went still. For the first time that morning, Sherwin looked uncertain. After reviewing the evidence and hearing both sides, the judge granted the protective order. She awarded Janiyah exclusive possession of the residence pending further proceedings and ordered Sherwin to have no contact except through lawful channels permitted by the order. Then she addressed the occupancy issue. The court has heard testimony that additional family members currently reside in the home through Mr. Holt's presence there, she said. Because exclusive possession is being awarded to the petitioner, those occupants must also vacate the residence. That landed harder than anything else said all morning. Augustine stared straight ahead. Vernice looked down. Trayvon shifted in his chair. The judge directed local law enforcement to assist with enforcement of the order and supervise the property transition to prevent further conflict. I felt something in my chest loosen that had been clenched for weeks. Janiyah's hand found mine. For the first time since that kitchen floor, her grip felt steady instead of shaking. We followed the deputies back to the mansion that afternoon. I stood near the driveway with Royale's small hand in mine, watching as Vernice carried out boxes with her mouth set in a hard line, as Trayvon loaded duffel bags into a car without speaking, and as Sherwin stood frozen on the porch for a moment before a deputy reminded him it was time to leave. Augustine was the last one out. He moved slower than the others, like every step cost him something. As he passed Sherwin near the car, he leaned in close. His voice was low enough that I almost missed it. "This isn't over," he muttered, "not with what we put into that house." Sherwin didn't answer, but I saw the look that passed between them. Something tight, something worried, something that told me this fight hadn't ended. It had simply changed shape. I should have known peace wouldn't sit still long in my life. It never does. It just gets quiet enough to let you lower your guard before something else comes walking through. Augustine's words in that driveway stayed with me longer than I wanted them to. This isn't over. Not with what we put into that house. I turned that sentence over so many times in the days after the hearing that I started seeing things differently. Old conversations, old comments, things I'd brushed past without a second thought. One memory kept coming back. A month before any of this reached court, I'd mentioned to my cousin Yolette that I was meeting with a lawyer. Nothing specific. Just that I was getting advice. 3 days later, Vernice somehow made a comment to Janiyah about people trying to run to attorneys instead of handling family business. At the time, I assumed it was coincidence. Now I wasn't so sure. The more I thought about it, the more little moments started lining up. Yolette had been around the edges of this whole situation from the beginning, always quick with sympathy whenever I called upset, always asking how things were progressing, whether Sherwin had responded, whether Janiyah was feeling stronger, whether I'd spoken to Thaddeus again. None of it seemed strange at the time. Family asks questions. That's what family does. But suddenly I found myself wondering how much of what I said had stayed inside those conversations. The final piece came from Janiyah. She mentioned, almost in passing, that Vernice had once referenced something oddly specific, a detail involving timing at Thaddeus's office that neither Sherwin nor his family should have known. I felt something click into place. There weren't many people I had discussed that with. In fact, there was only one, Yolette. I called her over for coffee 2 days later. I kept my voice easy when I invited her. Let her settle into my kitchen like nothing was wrong. We talked about church events, grocery prices, and Royale for nearly 20 minutes before I asked the question. "How'd you and Augustine get so friendly?" Her spoon stopped moving for half a second. Then it started again. A tiny thing. Easy to miss if I hadn't already been watching. "He's not so bad," she said. "He helped me out with something is all." "Helped you with what?" She looked down into her cup. A debt. Some money I owed after my car got repossessed last year. Augustin covered it. I felt something cold settle low in my stomach. And, in exchange? Her eyes lifted. What do you mean? What did he want, Yolette? The silence stretched. Too long. Way too long. Finally, she exhaled. He just asked how things were going. How things were going. With Janaya. With you. That's all. That's all? She nodded too quickly. I didn't think it was a big deal. He'd ask questions. I'd answer them. Everybody was talking about it anyway. Everybody wasn't discussing meetings with my lawyer. Her hands froze around the coffee cup. The room suddenly felt smaller. He asked about that too? I said quietly. She didn't answer. About court dates? Nothing. About timing? Still nothing. I felt the betrayal settle into my chest, the way water finds cracks in a foundation before anyone realizes the damage is there. This wasn't a stranger. This wasn't even Sherwin's family directly. This was blood. Someone sitting in my own kitchen who had been carrying pieces of my private life straight into the hands of people trying to take my daughters home. I looked at her steadily, the same way I'd looked at Sherwin on that kitchen floor. How long, Yolette? She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. And in that silence, I finally got my answer. Maybe not the exact timeline, maybe not every conversation, but enough. Enough to understand that whatever she'd been doing, it hadn't started recently. And enough to understand that Augustin hadn't known nearly as much as he did by accident. Yolette never did answer me that day. She just gathered her purse and left my kitchen without finishing her coffee. And I let her go because I needed my hands free for something more important than chasing an explanation I already understood. I called Thaddeus that same afternoon and told him what Augustin had said in that driveway. Not with what we put into that house. I told him about Yolette, about the debt, about how long someone in my own family had been quietly handing my private business to the people trying to take my daughters home. Thaddeus didn't sound surprised. He sounded like a man whose suspicions had just been confirmed. I want you to come in, he said. There's something I need to show you. I sat across from him the next morning while he laid out folder after folder on his desk. Not property records, court filings, documents that had surfaced during and immediately after the protective order proceedings. Some had been attached to responses filed by Sherwin's attorney. Others came from materials Augustin's side had already begun gathering in anticipation of challenging possession of the property. Long before any formal property claim had been filed, they had been preparing one. Look at this, Thaddeus said, sliding several pages toward me. They were copies of utility payment records attached to one of the filings. 3 separate payments on the water and electric bills for that house, he said, all made from an account connected to Augustin Holt. The amounts weren't large, a few $100s here, a few hundred there. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to create a paper trail. A pattern of what? I asked. Contribution, Thaddeus said. When somebody wants to argue they've invested in a property, they start building evidence that they regularly contributed to it. Utility payments aren't enough by themselves, but they're often used as supporting pieces. My stomach turned. He's been laying groundwork. Looks that way. Thaddeus opened another folder. This one was thicker. Invoices, repair estimates, project summaries, all stamped with a contractor name I'd never heard before. Coram Renovations and Restoration. These were included in materials Augustin's attorney referenced when discussing improvements made to the property, Thaddeus said. Nothing has formally been argued yet, but if he tries claiming a financial interest in that house later, this is exactly the type of documentation he'd rely on. Kitchen renovation, roof work, exterior repairs. The invoices looked polished, professional, convincing, almost too convincing. I flipped through them slowly. Do we know this company is real? Thaddeus leaned back. That's the question that's been bothering me. He turned his laptop toward himself and began searching through state contractor registration databases. Not hurried, not dramatic, methodical. The way a man checks something because experience has taught him to trust his instincts. Several minutes passed. Then he frowned, searched again, tried another database, then another. Finally, he turned the screen toward me. There's no contractor license under that name, he said. Maybe they're registered somewhere else? I checked neighboring states first. He tapped the screen. Nothing. The room went quiet. I looked back at the invoices, the logo, the letterhead, the itemized charges. Everything looked legitimate, which suddenly made it feel worse. Because if the company wasn't real, somebody had gone to a lot of effort to make it look real. This doesn't prove fraud, Thaddeus said carefully. Not yet. But it does tell me something. What? He closed the folder. That Augustin may have been preparing this argument long before any of us realized there was going to be a fight over that house. I stared at the stack of paperwork sitting between us. The utility payments, the invoices, the careful trail being built piece by piece. This wasn't a mistake. This was preparation. And preparation meant intent. Thaddeus brought in help once the contractor issue surfaced. He said proving fraud meant more than questioning a few invoices. It meant understanding the people behind them. And for that, he wanted someone who knew how to find patterns hidden inside old records. That's how Emery Costello entered the picture. Thaddeus introduced her as a researcher he'd worked with before, the kind of person who could track down court filings, business records, and background histories faster than most people could finish a cup of coffee. She had a quiet, focused way about her, the sort of attention that made you feel like nothing you said would be wasted. I want a full history on Sherwin Holt, Thaddeus told her. Before this marriage, before this state, if it goes back that far. It took her 4 days to call back. I was sitting in Thaddeus's office when the call came through on speaker, and I remember exactly where I was sitting, because the first sentence out of her mouth changed the way I looked at everything that had happened to my daughter. He's not new to court filings involving domestic disputes, Emery said. The room went still. What did you find? Thaddeus asked. I found a protective order case from about 9 years ago. Different state, different woman, different circumstances in some respects, but enough similarities that I think you need to look at it. I tightened my grip on my coffee cup. Who filed it? A woman named Celestine Buford. The name meant nothing to me, at least not yet. The order was granted, Emery continued. According to the records, she retained possession of a residence after the case concluded. What kind of residence? Thaddeus asked. A house she owned before the marriage. The room grew quieter, not because that proved anything, because it sounded familiar. Emery continued. I don't want to overstate the similarities until we have more documentation, but there are a few things that stood out. Family members appear to have lived in the home for extended periods. There was a dispute involving financial contributions to the property. And there was later civil litigation connected to the residence. I exchanged a glance with Thaddeus. Not identical, but close enough to make both of us pay attention. Anything else? He asked. There was an equitable interest claim. That got his attention immediately. My stomach tightened. The details are incomplete in the records I pulled, Emery said. But I found references to contractor documentation being submitted as part of that dispute. For a moment, nobody spoke. Not because we'd found proof, because we'd found a trail, and it seemed to be leading somewhere neither of us had expected. This wasn't random, I said quietly. Maybe not, Emery replied. But we're not there yet. Thaddeus nodded. The caution in her voice mattered a lot. Because assumptions win arguments in living rooms. Evidence wins them in court. "Do you have contact information for Celestine Buford?" he asked. "An old phone number and an address from several years ago," Emery said. "No guarantee either one still works. And no guarantee she'll want to revisit any of this." "Exactly." The room fell silent. 9 years is a long time. Long enough to rebuild a life. Long enough to bury things you never want to think about again. "Reach out anyway," Thaddeus said. After the call ended, Emery sat staring at the contact information she'd found. Then she typed out a message. Not long, not pushy. Just enough to explain that another woman might be facing circumstances that appeared connected to something Celestine had survived years earlier. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a moment. Then she pressed send. And we waited. Not knowing if the number still worked. Not knowing if Celestine would answer. And not knowing whether we had just found the missing piece of the puzzle or another dead end entirely. Celestine Buford called Emery back 2 days later, and when Emery played the recording for us in Thaddeus's office, I had to sit down before it finished, because every word out of that woman's mouth sounded like someone reading my daughter's story back to us in a different voice. "I almost didn't answer," Celestine said. "I buried that whole chapter of my life 9 years ago. But something told me this wasn't a coincidence call." Emery had been gentle with her, careful, explaining only what was necessary. That another family was dealing with someone who matched parts of her old story. She hadn't said Sherwin's name first. There was a pause on the recording. Then Celestine said quietly, "You're talking about Sherwin Holt, aren't you?" The room went silent around that speaker. Emery sounded surprised. "How did you know that?" "Because there aren't many men who move through people's lives the way he did," Celestine said. "And there definitely aren't many families who do." She let out a slow breath. "Is Augustine still around?" Nobody answered for a moment. That silence was answer enough. "My mother gifted me a house," Celestine continued, her voice steady but threaded with something old and tired. "Not the same way you're describing. Not the same city. Not even the same state. But close enough that I started feeling sick the second you called. I met Sherwin. We married fast. And within a year, his family had moved in and never left. His mother managed my schedule. His brother always seemed to be wherever I was. And Sherwin..." She paused there, like the next part still cost her something to say out loud. "Sherwin made sure I understood early on that the house wasn't really mine anymore, no matter whose name was on the deed." "Did he ever hit you?" Thaddeus asked quietly. "Once," Celestine said. "Hard enough that I finally stopped explaining things away. Hard enough that I finally understood I wasn't imagining the danger I'd been feeling for months." The room stayed silent. "I filed for a protective order after that. Got it granted. Got my house back, technically. But by then, his father had already started building some kind of financial claim against it. Renovations, contractor work, property improvements. Things I later learned weren't nearly as straightforward as they looked. I felt something tighten in my chest. "How did you fight that part?" "Barely," Celestine admitted. "My attorney at the time wasn't as thorough as it sounds like yours is. We settled parts of it quietly because I wanted my life back more than I wanted a long court fight. But he told me something I never forgot." She paused. "He told me to keep every document, every receipt, every invoice. He said people who run the same kind of scheme rarely stop after one attempt." "You still have them?" Emery asked. "I think so," Celestine said. "Most of them anyway. They're boxed up in storage. I haven't looked at them in years." For the first time, she sounded uncertain. Thaddeus leaned forward. "Would you be willing to look through them? And if the documents support what we're seeing here, would you consider testifying?" The pause this time was even longer. When she finally answered, her voice had changed. "Let me find the paperwork first." Nobody spoke. A few seconds later, she continued. "If it's what I think it is, then yes, I'll help." The following afternoon, she called back. She had found the boxes. She had found the invoices. And she sounded shaken. "You're not going to believe this," she said. Emery asked her gently to describe what she had found. There was rustling paper on the recording. Then Celestine started reading. The contractor name wasn't identical to the one appearing in Augustine's documents, but the invoices were. The same formatting, the same project descriptions, the same billing language, the same estimate structure. Even several of the line item descriptions appeared word for word, despite being created years apart in different states. The room went quiet. Thaddeus asked her to email copies immediately. An hour later, they arrived. He laid Celestine's invoices beside Augustine's. Different company names, different dates. But the documents looked like they had been built from the same template, the same hand, the same system. I stared at those pages spread across his desk. This wasn't proof yet, not by itself. But it was the first time the pattern stopped looking like coincidence and started looking deliberate. And that frightened me far more than any single fake company ever could. Augustine filed his equitable interest claim 3 weeks after the protective order put him out of that house. Thaddeus said he expected it. Said men like Augustine never walk away from something they've spent years building, even after losing the ground they built it on. The claim argued that Augustine had contributed substantially to the property's upkeep and improvement, citing utility payments and a renovation history allegedly performed by Quorum Renovations and Restoration. It asked the court to recognize a financial interest in the home, separate from the protective order, separate from whose name sat on the deed. For the first half hour of that hearing, Augustine looked confident. Not relaxed, not comfortable. Confident. Like a man who believed he had enough paperwork to turn a bad situation back in his favor. Thaddeus walked into that courtroom carrying a folder twice the size of the one he'd carried before. When Augustine's attorney finished presenting the claim, Thaddeus rose. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to address the renovation documents submitted as evidence of capital contribution." He began with the state licensing search. A simple fact. No business named Quorum Renovations and Restoration had ever existed under that name in this state. Not now, not during the years listed on the invoices, not at any point reflected in the records available to us. Augustine's attorney argued that licensing records weren't always perfect. Perhaps the contractor operated under another registration. Perhaps there had been a clerical error. Perhaps the paperwork simply contained inconsistencies that didn't undermine the larger claim. Thaddeus listened without interruption. Then he opened the second folder. "Your Honor, we anticipated those possibilities." He presented additional records, county permit searches, inspection records, business registration records, tax registration records, nothing. No permits tied to the major renovation projects listed on the invoices. No inspection history, no business registration matching the contractor, no supporting documentation beyond the invoices themselves. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Then Thaddeus opened another folder. This matter also revealed something unusual. He introduced copies of documents recovered from a prior property dispute involving Celestine Buford. Different state, different year, different property. But the invoice structure looked strikingly familiar. Not the same company name, not the same dates, but the same formatting, the same project descriptions, the same billing language. Several line items appeared nearly identical, despite being created years apart for entirely different properties. The judge leaned forward. For several seconds, she studied both sets of documents without speaking. Finally, she looked up. "Do you have a witness prepared to address these records?" "We do." Celestine testified by video that afternoon. Calm, measured, careful. She described her own experience years earlier: the gifted house, the family moving in, the renovation paperwork, and the financial claim that followed after she sought legal protection. She never exaggerated. She didn't need to. The pattern spoke loudly enough on its own. Most importantly, she explained that similar documents had been used to support claims against her property years earlier. I watched the judge's expression change as the testimony continued. Not anger, concern. The kind that settles over a courtroom when supporting evidence begins to look less reliable the longer it's examined. When Celestine finished, Thaddeus rose one final time. "Your Honor, despite extensive requests, the claimant has produced invoices but no permits, no inspection records, no contractor registration, no tax records, and no independent documentation verifying the alleged renovation work reflected in these submissions." The courtroom fell silent. The judge set down her pen. "Mr. Holt," she said, looking directly at Augustin, "the court has serious concerns regarding the reliability and authenticity of documents submitted in support of this claim." For the first time all day, Augustin's confidence disappeared. His attorney started to speak. The judge raised a hand. "Based on the evidence before me, the court finds insufficient credible evidence to establish the equitable interest being asserted here." She dismissed the claim with prejudice, meaning Augustin would not be permitted to bring the same claim again. Relief hit me so suddenly I nearly missed what came next. The judge gathered the disputed documents and squared them neatly on the bench. Then she looked across the courtroom. "Given the questions raised regarding these materials and the testimony presented today, I believe further review by the appropriate authorities is warranted." The room went silent. "I am directing that these materials be forwarded to the district attorney's office for evaluation. Not prosecution, not charges, evaluation." But even that landed like a thunderclap. Augustine's face never changed. His hands did. Folded tightly in his lap, they told me everything his expression refused. 2. News doesn't need anyone's permission to travel. It just needs one open mouth and a town small enough that everybody knows somebody who knows somebody else. I don't know exactly who said it first. Maybe somebody leaving the courthouse. Maybe someone who heard about the hearing from someone else who'd heard it from a friend. However it started, it spread. By the end of that week, the same people who'd repeated Sherwin's version of events without question were suddenly hearing a very different story. Patricia called me first. The same neighbor who'd barely looked at me in the grocery store months earlier now sounded embarrassed before she even finished saying hello. "So Len, I had no idea," she said. "I should have asked questions instead of listening to everybody else." I told her it was fine, though part of me couldn't help wondering how many people had decided who I was without ever speaking to me directly. Camille reached out to Janaya not long after. The same friend who'd warned her to be careful around her own mother apologized so long that Janaya eventually had to stop her. For the first time in months, people weren't whispering about us. They were whispering about the Holts. The details traveled quickly. 2 women, 2 states, years apart. The same contractor paperwork, the same family, the same pattern. That wasn't rumor anymore. That was a story supported by documents. People who once avoided difficult conversations started asking difficult questions instead. Questions Vernice didn't seem interested in answering. Questions Augustin couldn't explain away. Questions Sherwin couldn't control. Augustin stopped showing up at several places he used to frequent. Vernice, I heard, began telling people she planned to move closer to relatives in another state. But Sherwin reacted differently. He fought, not in court, not through lawyers, through the same thing he'd always used when he felt control slipping away: the story. A few days after the hearing, Janaya started receiving messages from people she barely knew. Some were polite, some were confused, a few were forwarding screenshots. Sherwin had been telling people the court got it wrong, that his family was being targeted, that Celestine's situation had nothing to do with ours, that everyone was rushing to judgment. It was the same playbook he'd used before. The difference was that this time people already knew too much. The messages didn't create sympathy. They created more questions. Then came the text. Janiyah showed it to me herself. "You ruined everything." Just 5 words. No apology, no accountability, no mention of the bruises, no mention of the lies, just blame. The same blame he'd been trying to hand somebody else from the very beginning. A few minutes later, another message arrived. "You could stop all of this if you wanted to." I looked at the screen. Even then, even after the hearing, even after the protective order, even after the evidence, he was still trying to make her responsible for the consequences of his own choices. Janiyah stared at both messages for a long moment. Then she locked her phone, set it face down on the table, and walked away. No explanation, no argument, no response. For the first time since I'd found her crying on that kitchen floor, she wasn't defending herself. She wasn't negotiating. She wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything. She was simply done listening. The moving truck came on a Saturday morning, bright and ordinary, the kind of day that doesn't announce how much weight it's carrying until you're standing in the middle of it. Janiyah didn't bring much back with her. Most of what had filled that house under the Holtz occupation got left behind, donated, or thrown out. She said she didn't want a single thing in those rooms that still carried their fingerprints. What she brought instead were boxes of her own life, the parts that had survived underneath everything: old photographs, Royale's baby books, a quilt her grandmother made that had somehow never been touched by any of it. Sherwin's criminal case moved forward separately from everything else. The threat he'd made standing in that very doorway now sat in court records with his name attached to it. Augustin's situation had become more complicated. The district attorney's office had not announced charges, but subpoenas had already begun going out for records connected to the disputed renovation. Documents. Attorneys who once seemed eager to advance his claim were now considerably more cautious than they had been only weeks earlier. For the first time since this started, the Holtz weren't the people asking questions. They were the ones answering them. None of it was finished. I understood that. Courts take their time, and justice, when it's thorough, rarely arrives all at once. But the shape of it had changed completely. The Holtz were no longer standing inside my daughter's home, deciding what she could and couldn't do. They were on the outside of it now, explaining themselves to lawyers, investigators, and courts, while she stood on the inside, finally able to breathe. I drove over that afternoon to help her unpack, and I found her in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd once found her crying on the floor, wiping down counters that didn't need wiping, just needing something to do with her hands. "How does it feel?" I asked her, "being back?" She set the cloth down and looked around the room slowly, like she was seeing it for the first time in over a year. "Quiet," she said. "Good quiet. Not the kind where I was scared to make noise." Royale ran past us just then, barefoot, laughing, chasing something only he could see down the long hallway toward the living room. No flinching. No careful glance toward a closed door to check who might be listening. Just a little boy running through rooms that finally belonged to him without conditions attached. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched him disappear around the corner, his laughter echoing off walls that had spent over a year learning to stay silent. Janiyah came and stood beside me, resting her head briefly against my shoulder, the way she used to when she was small enough for me to carry. "Thank you, Mama," she said, "for not letting it go." I didn't have a long answer for that. I just held her hand and let the quiet sit between us, the good kind, the kind we'd both earned. Later that evening, after she and Royale had gone to bed, I stood alone in the front doorway of that mansion, looking back into the house I'd gifted her in love and had now helped her reclaim in justice. The rooms were quiet. The driveway was empty. No extra cars, no unwanted guests, no voices trying to convince my daughter that what belonged to her somehow belonged to somebody else. I thought about that first afternoon. The bruises, the threat, the confidence in Sherwin's voice when he believed nobody could stop him. And I thought about the sentence I'd said without raising my voice. I hope you have a good lawyer. Back then, he laughed. Standing there now, looking at a house his family no longer controlled, at court cases they never expected to be defending, I finally understood what destroyed them. It wasn't me. It wasn't Thaddeus. It wasn't even the courts. It was the moment they became so certain they would never face consequences that they stopped hiding what they were doing. He should have listened the first time I said it.